Rule 23, we're into our lights and our shapes. We're going to start looking at different types of vessels and the light configurations they have and if they have day shapes. The first one we're going to look at, Rule 23, is for power-driven vessels underway. Let me start by saying with power-driven vessels underway, we're going to see where we have some few different configurations of lights. I'm going to start off with what I consider kind of a baseline of what we're going to see for a power-driven vessel, and we're going to build from there and then add in different types of vessels as we go along for Rule 23. So the first one we look at here is the less than 50 meter power-driven vessel. And so with our less than 50 meter power-driven vessel, the first lights I like to point out is we have our side lights and we have our stern light, because this is going to be found on just about every vessel is our side lights and our stern light. And remember, with these three lights, we can see any one of those lights, sometimes two, from any angle of the vessel. So 360 degrees, we're going to see a light, whether it be individual side light, both side lights, stern light. And then we see, as well as our side lights and stern light, a masthead light. And this is important because the masthead light is what tells us this vessel is power driven. You're going to see as we go through these lights and shapes for these vessels that are not power driven, like sailing vessels and vessels being towed, do not have that masthead light. So we'll talk more on that later. But for this less than 50 meter power driven vessel, we have side lights, stern light, and our single masthead light. And when we look back to our table that shows the lengths of vessels, every time we hit 50 meters, we start to add additional lights, which we're going to see here in just a minute. But for a power driven vessel, less than 50 meters, side lights, stern light, and one masthead light. That's our less than 50 meters. If we now look at a power-driven vessel that is 50 meters or greater, we hit 50 meters and greater, we're going to see our side lights, our stern light, and now we see two masthead lights. So we have one masthead light forward, and then we have one masthead light that is further back and higher up. So now we see them like this. And so that power-driven vessel that's 50 meters or greater gets an additional masthead light, so he has two masthead lights, and that positioning of those is important, that we have one forward, one higher up and further back than the other masthead light. That's all we're going to add for this power-driven vessel is the additional masthead light. So still has side lights, still has stern light, and then we have our two masthead lights. And one thing to point out with our power-driven vessels, and almost really any vessel that we notice between them, is where these lights might be located, especially the side lights. Where you have a superstructure that is somewhere in the midships of the vessel, that's where you're probably going to see your side lights. And then, for instance, the 50 meters or greater image you see, the bridge or superstructure is further aft, so that's where the side lights tend to be. So when you're looking at those pictures of just the lights and you're trying to figure out what type of vessel it is, keep an open mind of where that bridge might be located. Moving on to still Rule 23 under power-driven vessels, they include our air cushion vessels, or for what most people might call a hovercraft. They split this up into a displacement mode and non-displacement mode. And so non-displacement mode would be when the air cushion underneath the vessel is filled with air, and versus the displacement mode is when it might not be. And so if we look at the displacement mode on this, or when that air cushion is not filled, then it's just like a normal power-driven vessel. We get side lights, a stern light, and a masthead light. And if we look at the image where we're in non-displacement mode, again, when that air cushion underneath the hovercraft is filled with air, now we have the side lights, the stern light, the masthead light, and a flashing light. So if you think back to our definitions, what was the flashing light? Well, it could be any color, but this one is specifically yellow. And that flash rate is 120 per minute, so about 2 per second for that flashing light. And so that's what we see specifically on the air cushion vessel or the hovercraft when it's in non-displacement mode. The same lights of a power-driven vessel, but with that additional flashing light. So that is our air cushion vessel. Next, we start to look at power-driven vessels, so still under Rule 23, but less than 12 meters. So what you see is a little runabout for the rule book image, and we see side lights. However, in this picture, they're now combined into one lantern. This is a rule vessels less than 20 meters can combine their side lights into one single lantern. So even though it says in this picture less than 12 meters, that's what we see first, is the side lights are combined in that single lantern. But really for less than 12 meters, where this rule kicks in is that we don't see a masthead light. We actually see, instead of a masthead light, they've given us an all-around light for that less than 12 meter power-driven vessel. So what they've done is essentially that you're seeing the same light, but they've combined the masthead and the stern light into one all-around. If you think about it, when they're separated, you still see a white light from any angle. In this case, they've just added it into one all-around white light. And because it is less than 12 meters, you can see it's just slightly off from center line. While they like to see the light center line, it is allowed to be slightly off center. That is what we can see for power-driven vessels less than 12 meters is, instead of separate masthead light and stern light, an all-around light. And we also have our side lights combined into one unit, one housing. So that is actually allowed on vessels less than 20 meters. The last type of vessel that we may see, and this one falls under the international, is our less than 7 meters that does less than 7 knots. And so that's the picture you see is the little guy in the runabout. Well, he's got no side lights, and we just have the all-around light. So under the international side of the rules, less than 7 meters, it does less than 7 knots, can get away with just having an all-around white light. A couple options there for our smaller vessels. As I usually tell my classes, when we get to less than 12 meters, not that the rules necessarily lighten up, but the specificities of the specifics of the lights and things like that and the requirements for sound signals tend to be a little less. And so that's one area where I pointed out for this is the all-around light and the combined side lights. The final vessel that we're going to look at for Rule 23 power-driven vessels is this one specific to the inland rules, so the inland side of the book, and that is on the Great Lakes. The Lakers may combine the after masthead light, so if he's 50 meters or greater in length, they have the after masthead light. So these Lakers can combine that masthead light and the stern light into one all-around white light. So it would make more sense when you see the image here, right here. The superstructure is more forward on these vessels, and that where that after masthead light would be placed and the stern light, instead of having them be separate lights, they are just combined, and so you have one all-around white light. Those are our lights for Rule 23 power-driven vessels.